Welcome back to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez, your podcast host. Today's guest has a wealth of different industry experiences in both the public and private sectors. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast content, and my guest today is Mark Gustowski. He was formerly the Chief Executive Officer of the Queensland University of Technology's Creative Enterprise Australia. I started off the podcast, as I typically do, by asking about how his leadership journey started. I hope you enjoy the podcast and much more content to come. Have a great one, and over to Mark.
I don't think I ever really sought out to be a corporate leader in any way. It was probably much more organic for me in my career. I actually started my career back in the late 90s in the Victorian state government and in a graduate scheme working under the Kennett government, which was a lot of fun. And certainly being there with the unlosable election, if anyone remembers, in 99, where Kennett lost to the school teacher in Brumby. Interesting thing in that time, and I was working in industry and startup policy, was that the incoming government that won was certainly not prepared to be in power. They didn't think they were going to win. And I think the good thing about that was that they ended up carrying forward policies that were essentially written up and drawn up by the previous government, the Liberal government. And so we had a period of leadership change, but ongoing consistent policy and program implementation, which was a really interesting lesson to me in how organisations can run effectively. Because normally when you see government changes, all sorts of things stop and they get completely moonscaped. Whereas in Victoria in 99, what we saw was a consistent leadership pattern of program delivery, although the leaders changed. And I think maybe if Labor had been more organised and thought they might win, that wouldn't be quite the case. But I think Victoria was much better off for it. Because essentially what we ended up having in Victoria in the innovation space then was close to a decade, Eric, of consistent support for industry, innovation, entrepreneurship, which put Victoria in the position it is in today, which is, really one of the national leaders in the space. So I started off in government and then spun out of there pretty quickly to join my first startup, which was in the biotech space. I was brought on board as the first hire and was involved in setting up and winding down that company in 18 months. Which was a wonderful lesson in startup life, but also in leadership to a degree, in letting staff go very quickly, winding up a company very quickly, and then looking to move on to the next thing. And over the time, I've probably been involved in or co-founded another 5 startups and been involved in the delivery of a number of programs. I've always been in the startup at the innovation and entrepreneurship space. I've designed and delivered probably 14 accelerator programs across the country, which I really enjoy. I enjoy because as a leader in those areas, you get to work with so many different characters. And leadership is really about knowing and understanding the traits of different characters and how to bring the best out in them. And one of the really interesting things that I undertook when I was working in the UK for a large engineering firm on the London 2012 Olympics was putting together engineering teams very quickly and to look at personality types and really deeply understand personality types. And I became trained up in the Myers-Briggs indicator personality profile types and used those as a backbone to build teams rapidly in the engineering space. And what that taught me was to understand that different personality types react and respond to different types of leadership. And I think the most important trait of a leader is having self-awareness. Leaders without self-awareness often cannot then relate to how they affect others. And I think quite early on, I did learn that knowing how you relate to others and knowing your own personality type definitely allows you to become a better leader because you can sympathise and empathise with how others might best respond to working styles. And so working across startups and corporates and in the university sector and now with what you'd call CA, which is an accelerator and investment fund, working with a lot of different challenging personality types, both from a founder level, where you're investing in companies, right through to a team level, comes down to, I think, having a great level of self-awareness. So I hope in a roundabout way, Eric, that might have, talked about that.
It was a good way to set the context there, mate. I appreciate that. Can I ask you, from jumping between the two, did you see much, if any, difference between the leadership and management functions when you were working in those in the government versus the non-government sector? Sure,
absolutely. I mean, when you're working in the public sector, whether it's university or government or other, there are very rigid structures and processes and red tape that usually have to be adhered to, and so you need to be able to, as a leader, work within the bounds of what the system allows you and doesn't allow you to do. So often when you go into, say, a government organisation and you're working under people, those people will be more than likely very process orientated. Risk mitigation leaders. They're making sure that nothing is going to go wrong, and they're very good at that. Sometimes in governments that are forward thinking, they might have a few very outward creative leaders in there. And I was very lucky to work for a number when I was in the Victorian government of very, very creative, innovative leaders that were leading, industry policy initiatives. So Peter Lyle in Victoria, who was, I think, the manager of Regional Development Victoria, probably one of the best leaders I ever worked for in the startup, enterprise or government space, full stop. He just had a unique knack of bringing people together, creating a camaraderie between his team, which I think is absolutely imperative to get the most out of a team, but also providing a very, very clear vision for what the division or what the organisation is wanting to do. Similarly with Jane Nile, who worked with the Department of Innovation in Victoria, a very visionary leader, very different management style, like to get things done quickly, aggressively, but for a purpose. And then you do end up, for those that are listening that have worked in public sector, that have, lifetime public servants they work under that are more process driven and are more focused on process and the things that sit around process as opposed to creativity. I find that style of leadership, just because of my personality type, more challenging and more rigid. But depending on the team and the staff and the types of people they attract, they can be quite attractive to go into those sorts of roles. In the startup space, certainly it's much more chaotic. Leaders have to be much more fluid, much more willing to move and be very agile, because things don't go to plan. Very rarely are there structures in place. Very rarely can you predict what markets are going to do. So you have to be very, very reactive, be proactive, move quickly, sometimes within, sometimes outside of procedures. And you have to build teams that are actually comfortable and capable of working in those environments. So they're very different.
Yeah, it's you bring up an important point that it's creating your teams that can move in those environments is important. And from the sounds of it, from that response, that the building of the team has been important to you, and I guess applying a lens between looking at the differences between leadership and management is going to matter, because process is one thing, but leadership in changing markets and needing to be agile and all the rest of it requires quick decision making, or at least informed decision making. You use the word risk mitigation. That's I guess a critical part of that. Before I forget, as part of that process, because again you bring up a very interesting mix of different industry sectors that you've worked in, is the measure of success for you different in a different industry setting, or do you have a set of measures that you always look to say, this is what success looks like for me?
Yeah, it is different, Eric, because there are always going to be qualitative and quantitative factors of success. So the quantitative factors, the KPI metrics, whether you're in a startup or an enterprise or a private company, which is, revenue, sales, customers, customer churn, customer retention, is very different to say when you're in government, where you might have triple bottom line measures of success, which are more around economic development and things like that. But on a qualitative perspective, the success I think that remains the same is how efficient, how functional, and how cohesive is the team that you've built around you. And that's an ultimate measure of success, because a functional, effective, and cohesive team is much more likely to achieve the outcomes you're desiring, whether they be economic or social or other. So when I have either worked in startups or sit on boards of startups, or the current role I have at CEA, a great amount of time I spend, and probably what I think about the most after hours when I'm lying in bed and working out, the biggest challenges I have as the leader of this organization is, how do I make the team most cohesive, to be the most effective, and to be the most empowered they can be? And I think that is a real trick. There's a real trick to that. One is finding the right people and identifying the right people. One is letting the wrong people go in a way that is ethical, humane, and supports them moving to the next thing. But spotting people quickly that perhaps aren't quite put together for certain types of business environments is important. And so a measure of success as a leader in any organisation I go into very much ends up being how functional and how cohesive is the team that is working towards the same mission and the same goal.
Yeah, that's a nice way to round that off. Okay, so here's a one that I always want to ask. It's not in a negative, but it's about this idea that leadership is a lonely path. So, from your experience, what can you bring to that statement? Like, is it And why I asked this question, and I tried to get some clarification with a couple of podcast guests on this one, because they did ask me some questions pre the taping, is what was I looking for? And my answer to that, and it will come from your experiences, obviously, is that is it as lonely as you make it, or is it a circumstance-based thing, or what does that look like for someone that has had the kind of career that you've had?
My take is that at the end of the day, it is lonely, and it's lonely for a couple of reasons. One is the buck stops with you. There is no one to blame when you're the chief executive or the leader of an organization. Whether you're answerable to your shareholders or to a board or to other owners, there is no one to blame but yourself. And so as a leader, when things go wrong, admitting fault and quickly understanding how then to deal with that is incredibly important. The other responsibility as a leader, I think, that is very, you never expect you need to do this until you get into a role of leadership where you're responsible for a team that you care about deeply, is that it is your job to shield them from negative, external, or destabilizing factors. And by shielding them, that means wearing a lot of that yourself and allowing them to continue to operate in a way that makes them the most effective functional team possible.
It does vary from person to person. I've often said that I in my day job, I often look to my network to help me get through particular issues to do with the job, obviously, because this is what we're talking about in the context of work. So look, I appreciate that, mate. I want to flow to something a bit more positive if I can, and that is in your travels, and I'm sure you've met lots of different entrepreneurs and leaders. There's this theme around nature versus nurture. So what are your thoughts on the following? Are leaders born or made? Huh?
Well, it's such a good question. I think some people are inherently born with it. It's similar to the question, can you create an entrepreneur, or can you teach entrepreneurship? You can teach entrepreneurship. You can teach the process of building a product, launching a product, and going to market. That is all replicable and teachable. What is incredibly hard to teach is an appetite for risk as an entrepreneur. How do you teach someone the gut feeling it takes to mortgage a house to follow a passion project? That's almost unteachable. You can teach the process of entrepreneurship, but I often say it's hard to teach the intangible components of entrepreneurship. So looking at that with the lens of leadership, I think you can teach the process of leadership. You can teach and read about what is required for good leaders to operate, what are the skills and attributes, and what do they do. But there is always going to be an inherent part, an intangible part of leadership where someone is willing to take on the responsibility of others. And can you teach that? I don't necessarily have an answer to yes or no, but I think there are inherent traits that exist within great leaders that they have that come through nature. And then there are things that can be done through nurture to teach ways in which to be a better understood, a better listener as a leader. And so I think it's a combination of both. And I think you do need a combination of both. Now, examples in market might be Steve Jobs. Was he a good leader? A lot of his direct reports, I don't know a number of them, might say he was a tyrant. But was he a good leader for a company like Apple that went through hard times and then came back and probably had one of the greatest resurrections in business history? Yes, he was. Now, was he taught to be a great leader, or was that innate? That was innate. He dropped out of school early. Excuse me. He didn't have great parental support, didn't have a lot of mentors. So that was innate. There are other leaders like Satya Nadella at Microsoft. Are they leaders that have learned to become great leaders? Probably yes, they have. The current CEO of Apple, again, probably learned to be a great leader under someone like Steve Jobs by seeing different things. And so I think it's a combination of both. I think you need to have an innate desire and want to lead and take the risk of being a leader, but also being open enough to learn how to be a better leader. Those of you that might be listening, listen to Gary Vaynerchuk or Gary V. Has he learned to be a leader? No, he's probably an innate leader and is very vocal about that, and drags people in his wake to make sure they can keep up with him. So I think it's a combination of both. I think the best leaders really are a combination of having an innate trait in them that is a leadership trait, and also a learned trait either through mentors or through reading or through observation about what great leaders do.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. And that I've often called it fence sitting, but I think it can be a combination of the two. And some people are more open to learning than others, and that's across the board, I think. But there also has to be a bit of someone said this to me the other day, not on a podcast, is you have to have a bit of a mongrel in you to be able to do some of the things that are expected. Some people call it tenacity or being persistent, but yeah, the best phrase I can think of is having that.
You need to be able to make sometimes unpopular and sometimes very hard decisions that might be for the betterment of the company, but not necessarily of an individual. And that's a very, very hard thing to teach.
Sure. And it goes back to that question of the lonely road of leadership, that at the end, because the buck stops with you in a CEO's role or in your own startup company, wherever that is, that essentially you've got to make some decisions to keep the place going or moving towards a goal. And that can be uncomfortable with moving somebody on, or can be great when you're promoting someone. So there's all the range of things that you need to do. And I think it's decision making. Decision making is one of those areas I think that is a critical part of your leadership, whether it's in the positive or
and I think Eric, not to be morbid, but certainly in the startup space, you could ask 100 or 1,000 founders, is it lonely being a founder? They'll all tell you absolutely it is. And you look at depression rates or suicide rates in, people that run and own their own businesses is significantly higher than the general population because of the stresses that are involved, because of the loneliness that is involved, and because of decisions you need to make. And so whilst leadership is a lonely road, what I encourage all leaders to do is to reach out and have peers and mentors and other leaders that they can sit there and bounce ideas off and be around, because the mental health of leadership is something that I think we're really only starting as an economy and as an ecosystem to look at in a much more serious way.
And that's a very positive way to end it, is to look at those things, because that's come up before I do end the podcast, and not to throw in a way as a topic area, but that's come up quite a bit, that the mental health of our leaders and entrepreneurs is something that's not often discussed. Or even to ask the question, which we're being encouraged to ask now, is, are you okay, mate?
Yep.
To people that to see if they're okay, beyond the banality of a coffee when you walk by someone and say, "G'day, mate," and you're off to do your day, and not really worried about what else is happening. So I'm glad we ended on that note. Look, Mark, I appreciate your time. For those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. I'll catch you all on the next podcast.